What is up, people? Thank you for tuning in again for another fun-filled episode. With me always, the man needs no introduction. He is still internationally known on the microphone. Men want to be him. Women want to be with him. During his sexual explorative phase many years ago, he went by Smokey the Bear. Ladies and gentlemen, AG, let's hear it.
I was putting out forest fires.
Yeah. Starting them and putting them out all at the same time. How you doing, buddy?
Good. This week we're going to have a little bit of fun with somebody that I didn't expect to have this much fun with. As not being a literary mind, I think the last time that I read a book, T to B or F to B.
Front to back.
Yeah, front to back. Probably college. So
you read like you wipe.
Yeah. Now I just use water. Now I just read on my phone.
We just talked about this. I'll be upgrading to a bidet here later this week, so expect an update next week, I guess.
Life changing, buddy. Mm-hmm. It's one of those things where I don't know if later in life people gravitate towards literature or it's something that they've been raised with or understand, but I think sports has always been my filler for that. Mm-hmm. And I don't.
But sports is just storytelling in its own right.
But it's very lazy to just have to sit there and watch.
You also like pro wrestling, which is insane storytelling. I mean, the writers, some of the people that have been writers on that are nuts.
Yeah, and it is theater in and of itself. But to actually sit down, I don't like when people are like, oh, my ADD kicked in. I really think I might, because if I tried to sit down and read a book, like it just may have been undiagnosed.
That's why books on tape are so popular. This is a person that I have changed several opinions on this person just in doing the research alone over the last 5 days or so. But it's kind of like I was telling you. I think how they always say the expression is you got to separate the art from the artist. So this has to take that one step further. This has to be separating both art from the artist, and then separating the artist and the person known like super publicly from just the human being. And I think in this situation, maybe I'm like a 2 for 3 pro in favor of this dude.
Yeah, I went into it not feeling like he was a great man, but I gained a little bit more respect for him and
He is the world's most interesting man.
Yeah, and he does look like it.
Yeah.
He looks like the dude in the commercials.
That's got to be the inspiration for that, right?
Maybe?
Yeah, because they're always doing shit like big game fishing and hunting or like something like that with that dude.
Yeah, and that was this guy's deal. So before we get into Hemingway,
before we get so deep into Ernesto Hemingway, Ernest Miller Hemingway.
I got something that I got to share. We always talk about you guys getting on and hooking us up with some 5-star reviews on Spotify.
Read, rate, subscribe, review, whatever you call it.
Yeah, and you keep coming through. We're getting close to 100 on Spotify, which is fucking awesome.
Those Can't wait for that to the happen. Moon.
I don't know why. Oh, there it is. But yeah, we got another 5-star review. Thank you, Jaw, on Apple Podcasts. I don't really. I get that it's a good thing. I'm still a little confused by it, but I love that. I love the.
Is it the Keanu Reeves?
The mystery, yeah. So. Jaw writes, when Keanu Reeves is not acting, playing music, or riding one of his motorcycles, he likes to use an alias to get high with a friend and delve into the history of a variety of subjects and events. Close your eyes, listen, and imagine what I'm saying is true. Great podcast.
I think you're Keanu. I think I'm too sporadic to be Keanu. That's the thing about editing this thing and listening to myself. I realize sometimes how just like, hey. I am during this, which is good because I still get excited about this shit.
I never talk about quicksand, though. That's kind of a Keanu thing, right? Quicksand coach?
There's many Keanus.
Okay.
A lot of different versions of Keanu. And also, like the man we're going to discuss today, a very multifaceted person.
Absolutely.
So, ladies and gentlemen, strap in, hang on. We're getting balls deep in Hemingway. Ernest. Such a hot name.
He's no Jim Varney, but he is a character
That's
in
going
his
to
own
always be
right.
the Ernest that I think of.
I hear Ernest Miller. There was a WCW wrestler named Ernest the Cat Miller.
Of course there was.
So that's where my mind goes. But didn't realize this is another issue where, like, the age of things. Mm-hmm. Had you asked me when Hemingway passed away, I would have probably said like the 80s.
When was it?
I believe it was 1961.
Oh, that's right. Yep.
Yeah, so I would assume 20 years you could have moved everything up. But his life falls so perfectly into this little generation that I really can't wrap my mind around. Like, us as generational, we had Iraq and Afghanistan, like, really close together, and it was a conflict. I think Afghanistan was the longest running conflict ever.
Yeah, he falls into this weird, like, and I don't want to call it a sweet spot because of all the shit that happened and how horrible all of it was.
It's an unsweet sweet spot.
Yeah, but he was born on July 1st, 1899, so right before the turn of the century. And, you know, if you've ever listened to this podcast or know anything about history, I mean, from 1900 going forward, he was right at that age, too, when World War I was kicking off and he was old enough to serve. He was still technically in an age where he could have served during World War II, and maybe in a way he did. We'll find out some about that. And then even at that point, to go ahead and live another, 15 or 16 years after World War II to be able to see Korea, be able to see the fucking Bay of Pigs invasion and all that crazy shit. Like, not only is this guy, you know, this well-known, you know, famous Pulitzer Prize, Nobel Prize winning writer, he's also, like you stated when you summarized it, he's the literary Forrest Gump.
He shows up everywhere, and oddly enough, I don't know why it just hit me, because it feels like it was a pretty big event. And I'm sure even though he wasn't in America potentially at the time or for most of it, but we had a Great Depression.
Yeah.
That was a massive deal. I'm sure it was worldwide, just terrible for everybody. I think we only hear the American side of it, but we had to have been a global enough market by that time that a depression in the United States had to affect other places.
That's going to have to, of course, that'll be an episode, you know, about that time.
Yeah.
But I think it really was the focal point on it was the U.S.
Could have been.
I think it was just our markets took the largest hit. I don't think the markets were like the worldwide markets that we would expect them to be.
Import business, though, would have had to have gone down if we didn't have the money to bring those imports in.
Yeah, but they always say the place where the Great Depression hit the hardest was like the interior of the country, which wouldn't have been where a lot of like goods and port services were coming in. I have no clue, so that's something we're going to have to find out about.
But this age group in this generation, and just going through and hearing everything that he was a part of and just kind of all of the melee of his life, I got to thinking, like, if we didn't have the Great War in World War One, and then the war to end all wars in World War One, and then 10 years later, like, oh shit, we're running this one back and doing it again, and then after that, it's like, oh
10
shit.
years later.
Yeah, 15.
So World War One ended in 1919. I want to say that could be wrong, but then World War II didn't really kick off. It was in Europe in like 39 or.
So 20 years.
Yeah, 20 years. I was still.
We had a 20-year window where it's like, this is done.
And the only reason war couldn't happen at that point is everyone was still fucking recovering from the loss of the last war.
Well, and then we lead right into Korea, then we lead right into Vietnam, then we go into the Persian Gulf and just everything in there. I'm sure I'm missing skirmishes in between.
Oh yeah, there's always some shit going on.
These people didn't live like a common life, and I wondered, had we have just skipped all that, would all of our literary works be different because we didn't have that sadness? Because it seems like a lot of like great artwork and even great music.
It's born of struggle, I think. Yeah.
Well, and you look at it, it's sad to say, but usually an artist gives his best musical work when he's deepest in his
whatever
drug usage, alcohol
exactly.
usage.
Yeah,
and then
I don't
when they
think
get sober, it sort of changes.
people like to read about happy stuff, but I mean, you read, you know, a lot of the time to get some type of like visceral emotional reaction and struggle, and people going through hardships are kind of what most heavily like impacts you. So I think that's why people like drama so much.
Yeah.
They like to see people going through shit or hearing about people going through shit. The best way that I think I found that I can process and kind of look at Hemingway in my head is he was a guy who was never in someone else's story. He was never a character, regardless of what he walked into, if it was the middle of it. It was just that next chapter
true.
in his story. He was the starring character in every single situation that he was in.
Never ancillary. He always had to, it was either he made it about him or it just was about him.
Exactly, yeah. And so kind of getting back to the beginning, the front, as we discussed, and we'll get to the back later. He was born in Oak Park, Illinois, to Grace Hall and Clarence
Edmonds
Hemingway.
Hemingway, which doesn't strike me as really a Midwest guy. Oak Park is like a suburb of Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
So he was kind of born into what I would say would be more than a middle class, because Clarence was a doctor and Grace apparently had like the singing voice of an angel. She's
like an opera singer, right?
That was kind of her aspirational goal, but she had sang in Madison Square Garden,
That's
which
right.
I don't know if it had that cachet back then, but it was still the Garden at a very young age.
It never states that it was like Madison Square Garden at like 3 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon.
Yeah, well,
not a lot of people could show up. It was still in MSG though.
the Knicks weren't around there either.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
And kind of growing up, where he really gets his love for like adventure and kind of the outdoors and things like that, he's going to take that directly from Clarence, from his father. And going kind of back to what you were saying about his mother being an opera singer and maybe having a little bit, not refinement, but maybe a little bit more of that sophisticated taste or something like that. You could also tell after having her kids from some things that were stated that she said that she had to like give up her dreams.
yeah.
And like because of the children, basically it alluded to it that because of the kids she could no longer follow her dreams.
There's a
She's like,
bit-
you have to be my love now.
A bit of resentment, it felt like. But she was, I mean, their whole family dynamic growing up. Clarence was a doctor. She was an opera singer. She ended up making more money doing like voice lessons and like music lessons from their home than he did as a doctor. So I don't know if maybe we just didn't fund doctors back then, or maybe it was...
Could have been some bad doctors, man.
Yeah, that's also true. Clarence might have been a bad doctor. He didn't seem like a great dad, all told.
He's the doctor you go to get a prescription. He's not the doctor you go to for a procedure.
True, yeah.
Because you know he needs the business if he's that bad.
He was pushing pills. But his mom really focused on some weird stuff. He was the second oldest of 6. His older daughter, or his older sister, I think her name is Marceline. She's 2 years older, and her mom, or their mom, used to dress Ernest up in the same way that he would dress the older sister Marceline up.
Yeah, and not in a sense of like she used to do that like here and there. Like up until, was it the age of 6?
Yeah, 7.
Up until the age of 7, he basically was dressed as a girl.
They cut his hair the exact same way that she had her hair cut.
And then the only time that he got to be like a boy was he would go on these like camping trips or like hunting trips, sometimes for like up to like a month or 2 months, up to this cabin they had. Was that in Michigan?
Yes.
With his dad. And that's when he got to like dress like a boy and hunt and fish and do all that kind of stuff.
So, in a way, it almost like maybe sets the stage for the strife that his mom caused in his life being eased, going up there with his dad and being able to do stuff. And he's like, this is better than what I do at home. I'm just going to love this for the rest of my life. At the same time, though, Clarence was a pretty odd taskmaster. Like, he spanked him a lot. He beat him a lot. There were times when Ernest would get done getting flogged by the belt, and they said that he would go out and hang out in the shed with his shotgun. And when his dad was walking along, he used to line his dad up in the sights.
Yeah.
Like, some very dark stuff that I'm
they
sure
did not
probably...
have good in regards outside of that like outdoor stuff that they may have bonded over and everything. And part of that could have still been like an abusive relationship. He was just like, at least I'm in a nice place that I like having fun while I'm being verbally or abused or anything like that
all the time. And I think it was definitely a different kind of like stimulus, because it was probably more physical with Clarence, where Grace would probably walk by and say something in his ear and then it would just eat at him.
Such easy access to firearms for children back in these days.
Very easy. Yeah.
Well, like, just young owners would just go out with the shotgun out in the shed.
I'm not going to say that plays a factor throughout the rest of this story, but access to guns for these fellas.
You got to wonder how many times on those hunts in Africa, when he was looking down the sights, if he was wondering if the animal, it morphs like a cartoon into his father's head. Don't do it, Ernest.
The guy that's taking him around is just sitting next to him, and he just says, "Take that, Clarence."
Yeah, exactly. I thought he was named as Gun Clarence. I thought that's what his rifle's name was.
As a student, smart as a whip, very good kid. Got shockingly did really well in English. Did really, really well in English. Decent athlete as far as we can kind of tell. He played football. He boxed. He focused, it felt like, more on solo sports, because I don't think he was really, as we'll learn later, not really a team player.
No, not at all.
And that probably started at a young age. But had, a fairly good academic, and he was very shy, strikingly handsome young man. I'm only going to speak to 18 and older, but a good-looking child in his own right, I would say. So he was definitely attractive to the women, but
popular with the ladies.
Yeah, his personality wasn't that he could blossom and really take advantage of that situation. After high school, he ended up taking a job through, I think it was a family friend, at the Kansas City Star as
someone
a
that
cub
had
reporter.
where they passed on some of his early writings or something, even stuff he wrote for the high school paper.
Yeah,
or something like that.
He was involved in the paper and in the yearbook, so he had kind of learned at a young age.
And then he knew someone whose father or someone worked at the Kansas City Star, and so he ends up getting a job as a cub reporter, and that's kind of where he starts to first develop his writing style. And that's the big thing. We're not going to we'll mention his works when he wrote them and kind of the success that he got from them or the criticisms that the books had. We're not going to go, this really is kind of more of a breakdown of Ernest Hemingway, the person, because quite frankly, his books aren't as exciting as his actual life. Crazily enough, it's a very rare circumstances in which
the fiction doesn't live up to
that's what I was going to say, yeah. It's literally stranger than fiction. But,
yeah, I mean, full disclosure, the only two books of his that I read have been in my life, A Farewell to Arms, and then The Old Man and the Sea.
I read The Old Man and the Sea long enough ago that I can't remember it.
So, I love my dad. We didn't focus a whole lot on schooling when it came to Pops. I remember I was 13 years old, and he came into my room, and he threw The Old Man and the Sea and The Pearl, and he threw them on my bed, and he's like, "Hey, read these." And it's like, "What are we doing? What is this? What are you trying to do?" He's like, I read them when I was younger. I really enjoyed them. I think that you'll like them, and both very short books. So I think he kind of knew where
Better not find any pages ripped out of there.
Yeah. But these books were made in the 60s and 70s, and they were the old copies. It was the first paperbacks.
Yeah.
And very short, so I think he knew, my reading style at that point.
Well, that's what one of the comments they say about Hemingway's writings were, that his writings were made to be written or were made to be read, whereas some people tend to just write for either their own, not really enjoyment. Well, some people probably do enjoy it, but for their own benefit or for accolades or for reviews and stuff like that. He actually wrote to be read.
Yeah, and I think in that job working for the Kansas City Star and being starting out in a paper like that, he said on multiple occasions that the guidelines that they had for writers of the Kansas City Star really helped form his style of that short to the point, less is more.
It's an economy of words.
Yeah,
and
very
if you
much
think
so.
about it from even a reporter, it makes perfect sense because you're given a certain space on a page. You're only given so many words that will fit in that space, and you need to convey as much information, but also as much of your own, emotion and things like that in this story in a limited amount of, words. And so that's where, like you were saying, that style where it's very just succinct but detailed, but each word is very considered, I think.
Yeah, every word is thought about, and he uses something, I think he coined the term, it was glacier theory or something like that, where he's only giving you the first 20%, and the rest of the 80% that's sitting underneath the water like an iceberg is the emotion that 20% will make you try to convey on the character.
That actually makes a ton of sense, because I was literally watching an hour of Hemingway quotes, and someone pop up, and then I would read it, and 3 more would already go by, and I'm still thinking about it, and I have to rewind to go back, because I'm still that is... And I think this is also one of the huge gifts that he had. He was able to write certain things and certain quotes that were oddly specific, but were so broad that they could apply to so many different like people.
Yeah.
But everybody would associate what he was talking about with like a different event or a different portion of their life in which they felt that way. It was just weirdly broad, but it would make you didn't have two moments in your life that made you think of. It was one moment.
Yeah. And I really think that is where, like you say, I think that's where he shined the most. It was sort of one of those things where, like, you hear a lot about H.G. Wells in 1984 when people are like, oh, we can use this as a quote for our side, or oh, we can use this as a quote for our side. It's like, no, it was just that general enough
It's not
to where
the stuff's not ambiguous.
Yeah.
It's very to the point.
Yeah, exactly. And he really, I think, had excelled in that. He was working in like I think it was like crimes and murders portion. So he kind of started.
Fun.
You have to think Kansas City, Missouri back then, probably still.
Just writing the most fucking crazy obituaries.
Yeah.
Helping out, bumping those things up.
He just had to have punched up so much of that stuff. And we get into the point of World War I popping off. He tried to join the military, didn't work out too well because apparently his eyes are dog shit. Mm-hmm. Kind of funny that a guy who writes for a living has tough eyes to read things.
He's nearsighted. He can't see stuff far away.
Is that what it was?
Maybe. I don't know.
So he decided to fall in with the Red Cross, another just noble cause to do it. And he was shipped off fairly quickly after that. He went in May 1918. So the war started 1915.
Something like that.
Later on in the war, but at the same time, I think that was probably because he wasn't 18 yet when it first started.
Yeah. And the other thing too is it's interesting that because he did get in as the military, he looked for an alternative. While I still think he had it in his mind of what way he was going to participate if he was given the opportunity.
Yeah.
I think he was like, I'll go over there as an ambulance driver, which is weird that they'll let someone drive.
That has bad eyesight.
That's driving wounded people around that can't see well enough to be in the military.
All right, man, you can't drive a tank, but we'll let you drive this vehicle full of wounded individuals.
Exactly, full of all the wounded soldiers. I think that he had an idea of once he got over there that he would be able to find his way into action and be able to serve in whatever capacity he wanted to.
Well, and it's a lofty goal, but it is that expectation of like we said earlier, he wanted to be the main character. He wanted to find his way into it. And so he flew into France. Then he flew into Italy.
I think he sailed into France.
Okay, sailed. And then had to have sailed into Italy.
Flew across the sea in a boat. And then he would travel probably by rail from France to Italy.
Okay, that would make sense.
Yeah.
Because flying World War One...
Like
Not
literally
yet?
like the biplanes.
Okay.
And it was military aviation was like brand new.
Okay.
Definitely not going across the ocean.
No. Definitely not flying across the ocean.
So he ends up being sent to Italy, and he was going around to Italian. We're with the Italians in World War One.
Yeah, we got to talk about his first Red Cross move, though.
What was the first one?
His first job with the Red Cross there was a bombardment at a munitions factory.
Oh, that's right. And he had to pick up like dismembered body parts and mangled bodies and shit, right?
Yeah, so he was carrying out, they said that it was, he said that he knew that most of the people he was pulling out were women because of the long hair that was still attached to the bodies, and that was about the only way that you could tell. Ew. Sounds pretty rough. You got to imagine that kind of imagery and that kind of like physical touch in that situation has to do something to a guy whose brain is already that creative, to the point to where I'm pretty sure there were points in some of his books where he would reference a situation very similar to that, where you knew that he was drawing on something more real than not.
You could tell that he was using, and that's one thing. Okay, I'll say my first thought. You could tell he used his real life experience to influence his writing or to put that into other characters and those feelings. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I wonder if that ever worked in reverse, where some of the stories about him, maybe that were propagated by him, or where there weren't a lot of other people to corroborate it or whatever.
Yeah.
I wonder if some of those got punched up too in kind of a reverse way.
Could have been.
Like he was so used to building stuff up in his books and everything and to make them as, as dramatic as he could or as impactful as he could. I see that maybe bleeding over a little bit into some of the stories of like Hemingway the man.
more like a chicken or an egg. Like,
Yeah.
which one came first?
Yeah,
was
which
it the
was
punching up the
influencing which?
stories that led to the punching up of his life, or vice versa? But yeah, after he did the munitions factory, as you were alluding to, July 8th, he is running. Oddly enough, don't know how the Italian military works back then, but he was running chocolate and cigarettes to the boys on the front lines
Gotta
of
keep
the
them fighting,
Italian
man.
army.
That's what Italy runs on. Just chocolate and
Chocolate
cigarettes,
and
man.
cigarettes,
Yeah, it's just chocolate
and
and cigarettes.
cappuccino. But yeah, he was running up there, and they were attacked again. He ended up getting shelled, and he was very close to an explosion that happened. It blew him back, and this is where sort of the floweriness comes in, I think, of his story, because I heard and read probably 4 different versions of this story in history. And these people were historians, so I'm sure that they were just playing into the fact that Hemingway probably made a little bit of it up.
Yeah.
He said that as he was carrying an Italian soldier off of the battlefield, he was shot down and mowed off at the shins by machine gun fire.
That's not what happened.
I don't think that's what happened.
That's not what happened. What happened was he ended up being close to a shell blast, and he caught shrapnel in his knee.
But he also was
And
given...
then I heard that he then, with the shrapnel in his knee, carried a wounded man out. So this is what I'm talking about. Like, I don't see it being the version that you were saying.
Yeah.
I could see it being he gets hit in the knee with some shrapnel. It doesn't have to be a lot. When you say someone got hit in the knee with shrapnel from a blast,
small piece of metal.
it could have been
Does a
some
lot of
small,
damage.
and it's not like it took his leg off, but it was enough that you can't continue to serve, even if in the Red Cross, because you can't really walk that well. And so after taking this shrapnel in the knee, he ends up landing in a hospital in just a shithole, right? In Milan.
I don't know if it was that bad.
I know. I might
Ironic
sarcastically saying shithole.
It would be rough to get injured and then have to go to Milan for your treatment.
For what, like 6 months of recovery time?
Yeah, and he did receive, I got this wrong a long time ago, not the Iron Cross.
Not the Iron
It was
Cross.
the Italian Military Cross he
Okay.
was given for bravery. So he was given a military award by the Italian government for his actions that day when he did get blown up. So he must have done something fairly valiant.
Ernest Hemingway.
Yeah, I would assume that the valiance in the story definitely shone through no matter what version of the story anybody found out about. But yeah, while he's in dreary Milan, he kind of meets somebody who I think was a person he was chasing for the rest of his life.
Do you think the idea of this person?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, her name, she was an American. She was serving as a nurse over there, and he fell in love with an older woman, Agnes von Kurowski.
Good old Agnes.
Yeah, I believe she was 27.
She was as beautiful as her name sounds.
when they started hanging out. I think I did see some pictures of her. She wasn't too bad looking. But along with nursing him back to health, he just kind of fell head over heels for her. Just fell in love very, very quickly.
And in a way, almost convinced her. She might have really been in love with him and everything, but I wonder how much of it was him.
I think a lot of it was him.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it was the fact that he just had his first scratch with death. Mm-hmm. I think once you go through an experience where you almost die, all of your emotions and feelings are going to be at a fever pitch pretty much all the
You're
time.
going to be looking for something to latch on to.
Yeah, very much so. And Agnes was that. She nursed him back to health, but they would sneak out of the hospital and they would go see Milan and they would do this and do that together. And they were just kind of all around the city just being together.
Fucking shrapnel's not slowing him down very much, is it?
No, shockingly enough, he was cool to sneak out of the hospital. But he ended up having to head back New Year's. It was January 1919. He was discharged from the Red Cross, so he was coming back to America, coming back to Oak Park to live with his parents. He told her, hey, I'm going to go back and get stuff settled. Then I'm going to send for you. You're going to come back. We're going to get married, right? She's like, yeah, I guess that's okay. He's back there for...
sure. You go on.
He was back there for like 2 months, I believe it was, 2 or 3 months, and gets a John Deere letter from Agnes in the mail saying that she loved him.
Some John Deere letter.
It wasn't him, it was her. She ended up being engaged at that point to an Italian soldier, so I'm not sure how much it was her and just pretty much all him.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it was her. She happened to just be engaged. It was kind of her deal of being engaged to someone else.
Yeah, and So
Let the kid down easy.
Yeah, it was kind of his first failure in love, and I think it sort of sets a precedent of being so hurt by somebody that you want to make sure that any of the hurt that you pass out from there on out is you to somebody else instead of
Like,
them
you're
to
never
you.
going to let yourself be in the position where you're not in control of that.
Yeah.
You need to be the one that dictates the terms of the relationship. And I do think that that's very evident by the relationships that he has going forward in his life.
He wanted to always be the first one out, not the last one in when
Yep.
it came to love.
Yep.
So, licking his wounds, just trying to bring himself back. His mom was not a fan of him hanging out around the house. So she basically said, you got to go to college. You got to get some shit done. You got to do something with your life at this point. You're an adult. You went to war. I get it. Come back. You need to find something to do with your life. So instead of going to college, he ends up through another family friend, gets an interview at the Toronto Star Weekly, and becomes a freelancer and a staff writer, which I'm sure they were probably looking for somebody with as much life experience at a young age as he's had at this point. So,
Well, and at the same time, too, what's the availability of people like this?
True.
How many of Americans are over fighting the war, too?
How many people saw the front lines, but how many people had had this experience prior to in journalism before they came? Because I don't think journalists probably went into the draft, or well, I guess they probably would have went into the draft.
Yeah.
Draft was World War One,
I think there was a draft during World War One.
or just signed up for it. So you have a very unique kind of set of skills to draw from. Moved back to Chicago, September 1920, so wasn't in Toronto. Continued to work with them, and he was just sending stuff in left and right as the freelancer.
What's weird to think about is a lot of these newspapers have these offices. So, like, the New York Post has offices in Chicago and has an office in LA where they get all of this information, because you can't just gather national or international news
From one city.
so it sounds weird to say he worked for the Toronto Star, but he was living in Chicago. Well, they have these satellite offices everywhere to be gathering this information.
Yeah, and he was still very regular with the work that he was sending in. 1920 is also when he meets Hadley Richardson. Hadley Richardson was, I believe she was the sister of one of his roommates. And she came down. He was pretty much smitten immediately. I think I read that they had met each other and spent time together 5 times before he finally tied the knot with her.
Jeez.
Seems pretty quick, but I think it was about a year of courtship as far as... Yeah, that's not even fair, because this guy is a professional writer for a living, and they're long distancing back and forth.
She doesn't stand a chance.
Yeah, he's writing fantastical letters.
She's
to
like, I have to write you 2 pages. You can send me a fucking Western Union with 8 words and still be better than my writing.
Just wet my panties from across state lines with 2 words. But yeah, they got married. Hadley was his first wife, and basically as they were starting their life together, one of his bosses, who was a writer named Sherwood Anderson, said, boy, I know you guys are trying to look for a place. I know money's a little bit tight. He wanted to go back to Italy. He wanted to go back to Milan, I'm sure probably to try to rub it in Agnes's new husband's face and Agnes. But it turned out that going to France was a much better deal just because of the conversion rate.
Yeah,
Their money could go further.
He does this twice. And I don't know this. Okay, not only is he a great writer, he's a fucking hell of a negotiator.
Yeah.
Because he's convincing his editor to basically make him a foreign correspondent, which basically just means, hey, move to fucking Paris and you can still report on the news and everything. He's this young fucking guy, and he just convinces his boss, like, you know what? You know where I think I'd be best served? In Paris. Why don't you just send me there and you pay me?
Yeah, and again, he was still producing for the Toronto Star on a very regular basis.
Do you think if these papers are still in existence, you go into like their offices, they've got to have the Hemingway articles framed and put up,
I didn't
right?
even think about that, but yeah.
Yeah. Like where Hemingway got his start.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All this old yellowed newspaper that's still on the wall being like, this is the guy that
They have
we
the original
employed. This could
carbon
be
copies
you.
and shit of it. Like
Yeah.
that would be shit that you would just, yeah.
France was a very hopping place, I think, after the war. And I don't know if it
France
was...
in the 20s, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was necessarily just because it was post-war or because it was a cheap place to live at the time. But Paris was still Paris by then. We had already had the Eiffel Tower. They had already had a lot of culture driven into
You mean
France.
there had already been a World's Fair there?
Yeah.
And there you go.
Yeah. You know how I know that? Mm-hmm. Learned about it. This podcast.
But Paris at this point too seemed to be like it was the place to be if you were going to be, a literary great. And I'm trying to think of what they used an analogy about Paris that it was like 20 years ahead of everyone else from like a cultural, like a not really Renaissance, but like a culturally advanced. Because again, France wins and isn't like taken over in World War One. And so basically they're still relatively intact. So as soon as that's over, it just fucking pops right off again.
They are. You have to imagine, though, economically, they're still just ravaged. From the amount of human capital they lost. Yeah, that's where where the conversion rate comes in. The other thing Sherwood did for him was he wrote a couple letters, basically, like, they were like friendship. I don't even know.
Like friendship coupons?
Sort of, yeah. It was like he wrote them a friendship, like I'm missing the word when you go in for an interview. It's a letter of recommend, like a friendship,
a reference letter.
Yeah, friendship reference letter, basically. And over in
just fill in whose ever name you're turning this into.
Yeah, over in Paris, they ended up hooking up with a group of writers. Some people that I've heard of, some people I haven't heard of. Gertrude Stein,
Heard of her?
James Joyce, heard of him. Haven't heard of the poet Ezra Pound.
Heard of them.
And this blew my mind, but he actually linked back up with a dude that was an ambulance driver that he first met when he was over in Italy that was driving with the Red Cross too. His name was, oh boy, where is it?
John Dos Passos?
John Dos Passos. And that, along with that, we run into our old friend Fuck Scott Fitzgerald.
Yeah, what is your issue with F. Scott Fitzgerald?
What's the F stand for?
Oh, okay. You're just assuming. I don't know.
It's got to be
Franklin?
fuck, right? Because why wouldn't you go by just that?
I don't know. A lot of people went by an abbreviated first name.
F?
I don't know.
I think it was Francis, maybe. But if you're just going to give me an F, we're just going to go with Fuck Scott.
Give me an F. Yeah, okay.
And you'll know him because he was one of his major literary works, Gatsby, Great Gatsby. Mm-hmm. So very, very famous in his own right. It was almost like Paris for writers, and I used this analogy with you last night, but Paris for writers in the 20s was like Haight-Ashbury for musicians in the 60s.
Yeah.
If you were going to be somebody in that movement, you were going to have your fingerprints on this area.
It's a lot like colleges and what they're known for, running back you, quarterback you, and everything. France was basically like, literary you at this point.
And that's really what it seemed like, because you had these guys that would later on be coined, questionably whether it was Gertrude or whether it was Hemingway. Hemingway will always say that it was him, but they were coined the Lost Generation because they were the generation that had seen the Great War. Mm-hmm. And at this point, it was still the Great War and the war to end all wars because they didn't have...
They would be fucking crazy enough to start this shit again.
Same folks?
Yeah.
Same folks. But it was so kind of cool, their little clique that they were in. They had this place called the Shakespeare and Company bookstore that they would go to, and you can actually still go to today and see the logs that they, like the books that they were checking out to reading, like their log sheets for what they had checked out.
Really?
Yeah, so you can see all these famous writers, where they're pulling inspiration from what they were reading at the time that they were writing things.
It's fucking nuts.
It's so cool to think about.
Do you think of them sitting around like the cast of Friends in the coffee shop? And just bullshitting.
Yeah, I don't know that reference, but I can
Hemingway is fucking Joey. Just sees a woman walking, he's like, how you doing?
The amount of cigs I bet that they had to just sit around and smoke
Jesus.
back in France was nuts. But they just kind of formed their own group over there that were able to bounce things off of each other. There were parts where Hemingway would write things and Gertrude would look at him and she'd be like, too many words. Less is more here. You cut out this, and this. You're still conveying the same meaning. You're just adding more to it.
Yeah, think of having those people to be able to bounce shit off of.
Yeah.
Like, you get it nowadays with, like, certain musicians or, if you want to compare it to athletes, guys going to, like, tight end U, all trying to weirdly, like, help each other out because you think these guys are supposed to fucking hate each other being on opposite teams. But, yeah, you have basically, not only are you one of the best, writers of your age, you are now getting inspiration from other people who are also considered the best writers of their age.
Yeah,
and getting different perspectives and suggestions and all this shit.
Well, and everybody had such sort of unique writing styles too, that you could almost, it was like an amalgamation of thought that these guys were spewing out, and they were reading a lot of what everybody else was writing over there. Like I said, they were helping them do edits, they were helping them proofread things. Like these places, or these books that were coming out of there from these authors, it wasn't just a solo mission.
Yeah.
It was a group of people who wanted success, but they also were willing to help, which sort of is odd for Hemingway, because later on, Hemingway, like,
This seems like his last. This seems what ruined, like, a team for him. He tried the team shit when he was back as a kid at school. He was kind of solo throughout up until this point. He's like, you know what? I'm going to give the team thing another try. And then he realized throughout the course of these relationships that he had with these people that he's like, you know what? Nope. Don't like it again. Not a team player.
yeah, he shifted gears from groupthink to competition so quickly that it just completely changed his outlook on things. His complimentary style is about as backhanded as you can get, just with some of the things that he said about Joyce's works, about Fitzgerald's works. He even, like, guys were catching strays that didn't even need to. He said that Huckleberry Finn was like the pinnacle of American literature. Had he just cut it off, like,
3/4 of the way through.
3/4 of the way through.
Yeah.
So it's like Mark Twain, a guy who I'm sure was a big help for all these guys, like inspiration to read through. He's like, yeah, he was cool. He just wrote too long.
One of the OGs of American literature. Yeah. Someone that was a stepping stone to help get you up to this point. All right. Before we keep going, bathroom break.
Okay.
Well, hey there, all you sexy historians. How you guys doing?
It is time for
Socials.
Where can they find us on Instagram?
If they want to follow us, they can find us at Historically High Pod on Instagram.
That goes the same for Threads as well. You can also find us on Twitter.
Tell them about Twitter.
Historically High. That's historically HI on Twitter.
And if you want to email any of your comments or suggestions, where can they find us at, Adam?
At historically high podcast at gmail.com.
Gmail. All right, and back to the show. All right, and we're back. So, they actually have a son at this point, or they go back to Toronto in like October 1923. And do they go back and then have the son, or do they have the son in France?
They have the son in Toronto, I believe. And
Okay.
I think he probably, like, it was a time when he wanted to go back, probably because the Toronto Star was like, yo, we're still paying you money. We'd like to see you.
Yeah,
so maybe come back and see us for a little bit.
You got to check in, dude.
Maybe the healthcare system in Toronto could have been better.
Yeah. Hey, you've been writing a lot of stuff. Have you been sending us all of it? So, John Hadley Nicanor. Seems like a weird name.
Yeah, you would think that an all-white kid probably wouldn't go by Nicanor, but it turns out that he was named after Ernest and Hadley's favorite bullfighter, because they're starting to spend some more time in Spain. And a guy who arguably is the head cheerleader, somebody that we talked about in our bullfighting episode, this is right around the time that Ernest becomes the bullfighting lover that he was. And just really, really crazy how much his love was of bullfighting, and we'll get to it kind of in a little while.
No, they did have it in France too, remember? We did talk about that. So
Yeah.
he didn't always even have to go all the way to Spain for that.
But he really, Spain was just a great place for him, and he revisits it so many times in so many different spots.
Do you think, this is completely irrelevant, but do you think he saw his first bullfight in France and he's like, what is this? And they're like, oh, it's something, they do this in Spain. That's where it was founded. And he's like, well, shit, then I got to go see the real thing in Spain.
Yeah, I mean, it could have been. I don't think that he had been to Spain at that point, and this is really sort of before
I'm sure he had traveled to Spain at some point, maybe just not something that was documented.
Yeah, I mean,
He seems like someone that's just fucking going anywhere and everywhere.
well, they're first, and we'll talk about it here in a second, but they didn't visit Pamplona until 1923.
Oh, that's right.
So there's still some time. So this would have had to have been before that. But family return finally, and this is just a little bit into the future, 1924, Hemingway's first kind of book that he produced. It was a series of 3 stories and 10 poems privately
The
published.
first thing was actually, the first thing that was kind of published, right?
Yeah. Yep, 3 stories and 10 poems. It was privately published in 1923, and then his first mass publishing in our time was 1925. So he hasn't quite risen to the novel yet. It's mostly just short stories, poems, kind of different artistic renderings of the writing form that he's putting out, but he hasn't put together that one solid cohesive banger yet.
Gotcha. Okay.
So yeah, one thing that led to that was F. Scott Fitzgerald had dropped The Great Gatsby in 1925, and as soon as Ernest, in that competitive way, saw the adulation that Fitzgerald got for Gatsby, he knew that he had to put out a novel. He knew that he was now a step behind one of these guys that he felt like were less than his equal before.
Yeah.
So, and that was like he was ready to go, and that leads into kind of where that all came from.
So
Hemingway's
was In Our Time after Gatsby?
I believe it was before.
Okay, so technically he hasn't released what's considered his first novel, right?
No, and again, the In Our Time was just another collection of short stories.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
So it wasn't
a
like,
full cohesive
Yeah.
story, one full story. Okay, that makes sense.
exactly.
So like you said, the Hemingways first visited Pamplona and did this festival of San Fermin in 1923, and that was where he first became fascinated with bullfights?
He fell for him. They again, like we talked about.
That's like the OG bullfight to see. So like we said, I don't feel it necessary to go see a bullfight even for research purposes. But if you're going to go see one, I could see why that would grab you by the whole pageantry of the running of the bulls and all that kind of stuff, and then the bullfights. For someone like this that literally just, again, he thinks that this is a part of his story, and he's just discovering a love that's now going to be, part of his loves going forward.
Yeah, it's less of a festival of San Fermin and more of a festival of Ernest Hemingway.
It's the first
finding his
festival of
love.
Ernest Hemingway in bullfighting. Yeah.
And he absolutely loved. He would get Hadley up in the morning. They would watch the running of the bulls. There were later on, like, he would be bringing other expats over and other people from America and be like, you guys got to see this shit. Like, they just kept going back and back and back. And eventually, like, he was talking people into doing the running of the bulls. I never saw that he had done it himself, but like, he was convincing other people to do the running of the bulls for his basic, like, enjoyment.
So he could watch it, and then in one of his books, Hemingway ran with the bulls or some shit like that.
Yep. It was almost like he needed somebody else to say, yeah, he was at the running of the bulls, so he could put something in there.
Yeah, I was at the running of the bulls.
His love was born. He returned, like I said, the next 2 years, and that was when The Sun Also Rises. Just he wanted it. It was on his birthday, as we talked about before. It was early part of July that the Festival of San Fermin happens. So his birthday, he gets this idea, The Sun Also Rises. We need to write this about bullfighting. Jumped into it so headlong that he wrote this shit and finished it in 8 weeks. That was how fast he wrote that book. I guess maybe I don't know.
That seems insanely short.
Yeah.
And I mean, I know that his books aren't always the longest and everything, but I mean, if he knew what he wanted to write and he was getting all this, that's the other thing too. Sometimes people just have an idea and then they write it. Maybe he was just like, I'm going to start writing it when I'm done with all the ideas and I know what the whole thing is going to be about. So maybe that was also his style too at that point.
Yeah. And
Either way, it's insanely impressive.
to finish writing it, in 8 weeks, I don't know.
And for him to be satisfied with it,
Well,
that also includes rewrites and shit, right?
no, that didn't. That was just his first draft of it
Okay.
being done. But I figured to write that out that fast, I don't know how normal.
I still think that's very
insanely
short period of
fast.
time.
Hadley tells him, you need to get this shit published. You need to go talk to the publisher. You need to get back there. I think it was Scripps, something like that. That may have been his editor. Forgot to write that down. But it was the only publisher that he was with, like, throughout his whole entire career. He never ever switched from there. So he flies back to New York. They meet, and I'm sure knocked out their contract. This is going to happen. We need to make this all go right. On the way back, Ernest stops in Paris, and
As you do.
yeah, yep. And he struck up an affair with Pauline Pfeiffer. Pauline would later go on to be his second wife after just a very odd amount of time. But The Sun Also Rises was finally published October 1926, and it just blew up.
And am I correct in my remembering this, that when he left Hadley for Pauline and also kind of left his son at that time as well, he was basically like, hey, I'm leaving you guys for this new chick, Pauline, but I'm going to give you all the proceeds from The Sun Also Rises.
Yeah, he had this...
So that's going to make it. So that's going to make it all better. You're
guess...
going to have to relatively grow up without a father, and I know I've been cheating on you with this woman that I'm now leaving you for. But here's a bunch of money. I mean, that doesn't hurt as much, but
there was this kind of intense love that I think was still between him and Hadley, and it comes in the form of Hadley basically said, yeah, we can do this, but here's the deal. I know you're cheating on me. I know you're stepping out on me. You are going to need to stop your relationship with Pauline for 100 days.
Oh, that's right.
And if you stop it for 100 days and you guys aren't together, basically like you have a cheating moratorium.
Mm-hmm.
You can't.
At 100 days, you have the option of either coming home and being done with her, or
I'll sign the papers.
Yeah.
And she actually cut that short after a letter just that he had sent to her that conveyed just how much it hurt not to be with Pauline, which I'm sure he was probably still very nice to her in the letter, saying, I'll always love you, you'll always be my first, we'll always have little Jack in there with us. And he even says the best thing that happened to our son...
John goes by Jack, that's why you're saying that, right?
Huh?
That's why you're saying...
Yeah, John.
Okay.
John, Jack, they end up being the same guy. But he says the best thing that's ever happened to little John, and they called him Bumpy, I think was his nickname. And he said best thing that ever happened to him...
Hemingway was Bumpy, or
the kid?
Oh, okay.
John. The best thing that ever happened to him was Hadley being his mother. So, like, it was definitely... He was still...
He better be able to write a good fucking breakup letter.
Yeah, very true. She drops that early. Like you pointed out, the big major crux of it was that her and John would get all the money that was coming in from this first book, The Sun Also Rises. Once that was finalized, like, lickety split, January 1927, divorce happens.
And Pauline had some money, right? She came from some family money.
Yep. And May 1927.
So it's not like Ernest is like, take all the proceeds, I'm going into poverty. It's like, no, she's got money. She's gonna be footing the bill going forward, so it's cool.
Well, so much of that I'm curious about, because again, like we were talking about, did writers just not make a lot of money back then?
Because you would think, like, the publishing capabilities at this point, like, it's literally printing press type stuff, right?
Yeah, but so, you're the only game in town.
You are, but in town. How far are you shipping these fucking books? Are you publishing this in, was it New York?
New York is a publisher, yeah.
It is. So I'm sure you're able to get those out, but this isn't where, like, people can just, like, you're getting tons of copies made, shipping them all across the country. New York Times bestsellers are blown up and you're rich overnight. Like, it probably took a while for him to see a lot of money from this stuff.
Yeah, I would just imagine, though...
He would get advances probably from publishers, especially after this one was a hit. Then he started making money because they were paying him money up front, I would assume.
That's true. I didn't think about that. To me, it seems like, looking back on it now, without TV, really... radio, I'm sure, had its time limits as far as, like, how long programs would go. Mm-hmm. Books were kind of like the main form of entertainment inside.
I think it was more so the fact of getting enough books to people to make it successful and getting accessible for people to buy.
Yeah, I could definitely see that.
Because people have still been buying these books up to now. It's not like they've never not sold.
Yeah, I'm sure that Hadley and John got a pretty sweet amount of money after his death.
Yes.
From just everybody buying these books back up again. So, yeah, they were married that May 1927. And October 27th, Short Stories, Men Without Women, published October 1927. And, shocker, Pauline is pregnant.
He did not waste his time.
Yeah.
Why not?
Yeah, I'm sure May, I guess there would have been some time, but probably still like some honeymooner type celebrations to be that pregnant in October.
You know, without saying too crass, I don't think Ernest is the type of guy to pull out.
He didn't have a lot of kids, though. That's kind of the one thing that surprises me, and I think that plays into a theory that I have. But they left Paris, 1928. And one of the reasons they left Paris was Ernest got so drunk that he stood on the toilet and pulled down a skylight onto his head and cut himself up pretty bad and knocked him pretty senseless for a while.
Probably one of his first concussions,
Yes,
of
that's
which he had a ton of during his life.
another running theme where anywhere that Ernest goes, he's going to leave in some sort of
Maybe that's
ailment.
where he does have a common with Ernest, Jim Varney.
Okay, yeah.
Accident prone.
I figured maybe it was like he does everything else so great. Karma's only way is to make sure that he gets knocked on
He's
the
a
head every
klutz.
time.
So
every
he's a
time he
physical
leaves a
klutz
situation.
sometimes.
Well, he was drunk, so I don't know how much of a klutz move it
That's
was.
true. When was he not?
Yeah. Surprisingly enough, when he wrote, he didn't drink when he wrote.
Yeah.
and we'll talk.
No, one of his quotes was no, but strangely enough, one of his quotes is "write drunk, edit sober."
Really?
Yeah. So I think there might have been some bullshit to that. I see him as a guy. He also wrote early in the morning.
Yeah.
So you could say he wrote hungover.
And maybe still drunk.
Maybe still a little drunk from the night before. Yeah. Is that the catch? You just get so drunk before you go to bed that you're still able to wake up and write a little bit drunk.
You can't have a nip at 7 a.m. because you're still drunk from 4 a.m.
Exactly.
Yeah, could be. I mean, it's certainly a workaround.
So on June 28th in 1928, his son Patrick is born. And
Kansas City, Missouri.
In Kansas City.
They're back kind of second home.
And then that same year, he got a cable. Yes, they still did cable communications from his mom telling him that his dad shot himself. And kind of going back to his father, Clarence, apparently he had, a ton of bouts of like depression and stuff like that. And so
He was really, really worried about money.
yeah,
And one of the darker parts of this is he was so worried about money that Ernest had sent him a letter back saying, I'm going to send you whatever money that you need to cover whatever you have going on. And it showed up like minutes to hours after he had committed suicide.
I
So,
didn't know that.
yeah, it was like that quick, and that may have been punched up just to kind of drive it home. But there was a letter in the mail going back to Clarence saying, I'll send you the money.
They also say this kind of stuff from a psychological standpoint when, children don't have good relationships with their parents, and especially if it's, to be believed of the whole aiming a shotgun at his father's head, wishing his father dead in circumstances. And then at some point, again, quite a bit later in life, this is 1928, so he's at this point 29 years old. That's still, that's not very old. And so for someone to have resentment toward a parent and then that parent kills themselves without any type of resolution to it, that's gotta fucking weigh on you.
Well, and you carry trauma from childhood throughout your entire life. So those extra traumatic events with his dad, even the good times that he had, but he's still going to remember sighting his dad up.
Yeah.
But that's a pretty defining moment, I think, in a child's life that he's still going to have, on his mind.
Yeah. So A Farewell to Arms was published in September 27th, 1929. And basically this was kind of his like coming out party for American literature. And this basically established him as a major player in American writing. So this put him into that upper echelon, essentially, of American writers.
And a great book. I mean, I think that it was correctly critically acclaimed if it could make somebody like me, understand and enjoy it. But yeah, it catapulted him into being talked about like Twain and like an F. Scott Fitzgerald, like a James Joyce. Like these things, they're finally
All the things that he was after.
You got to imagine that once it probably took him longer to read all of the great things that were said about the book than it took him to write the book.
Well, in mid-1929, it's not all coming up roses for Ernest. He starts working on Death in the Afternoon, and on November 1930. So he's taken a longer time now to write some of these books. They're not all just coming out in 8 weeks. He's taking his time doing this. These are now up to his point. His next book coming in after A Farewell to Arms, he's the type of person that he has to surpass that. He's not going to turn in something that's just that or, par or below. And in November 1930, he gets into a car crash that basically it damaged some nerves in his writing hand. And so for over a year, he basically had to kind of take a break from writing his novel. And you might be thinking like, well, why isn't he just having somebody else dictate his words or write or anything like that? He wasn't that type of person.
No.
I think as far as, he wanted to sit there, be over the page, be writing in his own words, not losing any of the meaning, erasing it and maybe he just didn't fucking trust anyone else to be able to do that.
Well, I think after he hit with Farewell to Arms, that may, goddamn, it blown his head up to the point to where he didn't think anybody else was on that level to be able to
even write down the words that he's stating, that there would be something that they would try to change or whatnot. I'm not sure exactly what it was. Regardless, it was released actually in 1932.
And it technically was written in 29 because this whole time in the 30s, he only produces one thing, and it doesn't happen until 1937. So even though this was released, it wasn't a work that was worked on in the 30s.
Okay.
Which
the bulk of it had been done prior to, but there were still things obviously that needed to be finished. But
rewrites, different things like that. But his 30s, I feel like, was like his... I don't know. They had a second child at this point.
There was like bohemian years. His travel, his wanderer years.
Yeah, could be. That's probably a really good way to put it. So yeah, after... God damn, that last hit got me. November 1930 is when the car crash happened. November 12th, 1931, Gloria is born. So their second child is here. And so
despite that hand, that damage in his hand.
Yeah.
You know what's not broke?
Yeah.
Little Ernest.
Apparently, Pauline wasn't getting a lot of foreplay, but he was definitely still getting it home. Because that seems pretty fast. And that was kind of where something just sort of changed in the way that I think Ernest looked at life. Because Pauline's uncle bought them a house down in Key West, and they were still kind of traveling between Wyoming. This is going to be a sentence that nobody's ever said together for these places. Wyoming, Cuba, and Europe. It probably not a normal travel route for people nowadays. But he just kind of got tired of big cities. He got really, really tired of dealing with like metropolitan places.
There was something about like he needed a place to be able to write.
Yeah.
And like a place that was conducive, not just a home, but some place like an area that would allow him like a lifestyle and like just not what a city would be. A chance to kind of clear his head and focus.
And you're talking about Key West. You're talking about for somebody who's an avid fisherman and loves to be out on the water.
Well, that's where he first started deep sea fishing, was Key West, right?
I think so. I think it was Key West where it all finally started.
Yeah, for anyone not familiar where Key West is, it's the southernmost point of the United States. It's essentially a chain of islands, and then a furthest island is 70 miles off of the tip of Florida?
I think it's closer to Cuba than it is to Florida.
Okay.
So I don't know the age range or the mileage range, but they did say it's closer to Cuba than it is to Florida. And excuse me, I have to imagine moving to Key West after being in a situation of living over in Paris is just a complete culture shock.
Oh yeah.
Probably for Pauline, I don't think Gloria obviously wasn't old enough because she was just born. But even Patrick, I don't think it was enough for Patrick to have that big culture shift.
Yeah.
But his relationship over there was so much more so much different because he had an extra room to write. Like he had his own place that was, I think it was like the second level in their house, maybe like a separate area.
Yeah.
But he had like the run of that whole area.
And like the people that he would hang out with there in Key West were like locals. Like he wasn't like rubbing elbows with like people in high society. It was like the locals of Key West, so like fucking fishermen and like people in like fucking like regulars in bars that he would go in and like meet like daily and stuff like that.
His buddies just hung out at the local bars.
Yeah.
And so he wasn't, for all intents and purposes, a very successful author, writer in the world, but he just liked to go downtown probably in a sick-ass early Tommy Bahama before Tommy Bahama. Like he had his flip-flops on.
His Bermuda shorts.
And he just, some kid from Chicago that just figured out how to tan. He's just down there living life with those guys. And I think this is, I don't remember if it was Cuba or if it was Key West where his fondness for daiquiris started.
Oh God, I think it might have actually been in Havana because that's where he ends up living for a long
Okay.
period of time. The longest period of time where he stayed in one place was actually in Havana, Cuba. But I'm trying to remember what it was called. It was called like the Papa Double.
Yeah, Papa. Yeah, Daddy's double.
Yep, it was the Daddy Double. So it was the Papa Double, and I'm pretty sure that that's what was like his drink of choice in Havana. So at this point, like you're saying, in the 30s, kind of the Wanderer years, Pauline and Ernest went on safari in Kenya in 1933. I'm not sure if this was his first one, but I know that during his first safari, he shot 30 animals on his first safari, and it included like 3 lions and then a bunch of other shit,
He also-
which seems a little excessive for
Yeah.
fucking like 30. Like,
I
there's
think it
a
was
problem
10
when
weeks.
people go over and kill one, which I'm not pro or anything like that. I think we've gotten to the point now where we don't need to fucking like kill like majestic African animals and shit. But to go over and just be like, I'm gonna kill 30 of these fuckers.
That's it. One a day. I mean, that's just a month of killing straight.
You're extremely successful, I think, if you're shooting one thing. But if you're not like discreet or like you don't care about what you're shooting, it's probably a little bit easier if you're hunting everything instead of just one thing.
Just anything that moves. There could have been like another guide for another group of hunters over there that accidentally got in his crosshairs.
Yeah.
We're gonna get dark here. Do you think Ernest ever killed anybody?
Yes.
Really?
Yeah.
I just don't see it in him. Like, I know that he likes to kill animals a lot, but I don't know.
I think there was probably something that happened, and we'll talk about it, somewhere within the course of him being, covering the Spanish Civil War, and then, the time that he might have possibly been in World War II, and kind of the time between. I think there may have been a situation in which I don't think he actively went there to be like, I'm going to like kill someone, but I think there might have been a situation he was put in where it was kind of a kill or be killed situation.
Decisions had to be made.
For me, it's as likely as it is unlikely.
Yeah.
I'm neutral about it. I don't have a yes or a no, but I feel like it is possible.
It's something that's kind of overarched this whole entire study for me. Like, with as obsessed with he is about death and domination of things, the fact that he never took another man's life surprises me, but also at the same time, like, I think he got enough of his aggression out doing this shit and watching bullfighting that he probably didn't have the desire to kill like an actual human being.
I think he was put in enough situations where he had the opportunity to do it.
And nobody was going to say anything about it?
Yeah, that it might have come up at least once. But yeah, so he ends up buying a boat called, is it the Pilar?
Yep.
In 1934, and it is pretty much, it's either in Key West or it's down in Havana, right? Because it's the boat he uses to basically fish for marlin in.
Yeah, and he's just running it back and forth between the two because it's so close.
Yeah.
And that's 1934 is when he buys the Pilar. To Have and to Have Not comes out in 1937. Again, that was the only novel that was completely written inside of the 30s. So for the bangers that he put out, when he put out A Farewell to Arms, or when he put out Farewell to Arms was second, and why am I blanking? Oh, The Sun Also Rises was first.
Yes, and then Death in the Afternoon was out.
Yeah,
32.
so he hit Sun Also Rises was going to be in 1926. Then Men Without Women short story 27. You have Farewell to Arms 29. Death in the Afternoon is, what do we say, 32? That's a pretty solid hit list in about 10 years there where things just are happening very quickly. So to go like almost a whole decade, and I guess it was only a 5-year break, but
it's 4 pretty distinguished works by the time he's like 31 or 32.
Yeah. So for him to kind of have this little wanderlust travel and do your own little thing, that's cool. Also, safari in Kenya, he caught dysentery.
Thank
So,
God.
like we say, there's always just a little bit of karma that sneaks in on him. Like there's something that always is amiss whenever he travels.
Africa thanks you for coming and killing one of our animals.
He somehow got Montezuma's revenge in Kenya.
That probably wasn't that uncommon.
No, not for his kind of guts.
So in 37, To Have and Have Not, the only one written in the 30s. Now, in 37, little thing starts popping off called the Spanish Civil War. And so he's like, what? What's that? There's shit going down in Europe. I think I need to be over there covering it. So he switches back into like reporter mode.
Yep.
And he still has these contacts where it feels like first of all, who's going to say no from a news publication if Ernest Hemingway comes in and is like, hey, I want to be a reporter. I want to write stuff for you guys. Yeah. First of all, no one is saying fucking no. But he still has these contacts where basically, does he go back and serve as a reporter for the Toronto?
I think this was still the Toronto. He worked for a newspaper in Chicago kind of as well when they were there. Mm-hmm. Being in Key West, I don't know who he was working for exactly. But yeah, he was just a war correspondent that ended up being able to go back over to Spain.
So when he got over there, he ran into another writer named Martha Gellhorn. And...
literally and figuratively.
Yes, and...
He knew her he had met her in the Keys before. Mm-hmm. So they had sort of an introduction before, and now they're meeting, but this time Pauline's at home.
And if anything of his past actions have shown us, when he runs into a woman and his wife's not around, divorce is not far behind.
Anytime you hear a woman in this story, she's either going to be related to Hemingway or he's going to end up marrying her.
Yes.
Like it's either one or the other.
Yes. And he will be cheating on his previous wife with the one that he's going to marry. Yeah. So, yeah.
So, while over there, things get sort of interesting, and there's sort of like, I don't know if I would call it conspiracy, because it's actually fairly true, but being over on the Spanish Civil War side, he was on the same side trying to fight basically against the Franco.
Yes, so the Franco was with the rebels. So you had Nazi Germany and Hitler supporting Franco and the rebels, and then you had this Russia basically supporting the established government, whoever it was in Spain at the time. And
the communists, though.
Exactly. But you also, but on the other side were the Nazis, so the fascists. And Hemingway was like extremely anti-fascist. So he was basically coming over there and like, you know, he wasn't one to, and I've heard this description of it, and it's really accurate, but he was never just going to go over there and spectate.
Yeah.
His intention, regardless of what he provided for his reasons, he was going over there as a participant.
He was going over, again, the same theme, to be the star of the show.
Exactly, for the new chapter, the new character in his book. And so he takes the side, essentially, of, you know, the Russians who are backing, not really the Russians, but the side that was being backed by the Russians. The communists. And he starts to kind of establish relationships with these people. In what manner and for what purpose, it's kind of speculative.
Well, and it was found actually in the Russian archives, had a file with the precursor to the KGB.
Yeah, I forgot what it was called. It was like four
letters. Yeah, KV something or other.
NG
something that doesn't exist anymore. Yep. Bad organization.
Yeah.
But they had made contact with him while he was over there during the Spanish Civil War and had kind of talked to him because they had seen there were certain things. It was right when they had gotten to Key West, I think. And forgive me for not having all of this, but there was some sort of incident that happened at a site over there. And I think it was a fire that burned through all these houses. Well, these houses were just like ramshackle shacks. And it was all...
It was a fire or hurricane? Or
might have been
a tropical storm.
Something like that, to that effect. But it had blown through these just poor kind of...
It was worker housing.
Yeah, it was worker housing. But it was worker housing from World War I vets that had come back. And that was what they had gotten. So he had written some pretty negative things about America and about capitalism when he got back and seen that.
Yeah, it was a really scathing letter in his way of fucking cutting quick with very few words of the U.S. government for basically failing these vets, for basically allowing them to have to be put into these situations where they were having to live in basically tent housing for these jobs and everything. And so, yeah, I think that perked up the Russians. And again, they're not, considered our enemy at this point.
No.
They're going to be our allies in World War II, but there's always going to be some suspicion that immediately right after it's Cold War.
Well, capitalism is always the antithesis of communism. Anytime there is capitalism, there's always a fear of communism.
Yeah.
That's sort of how it goes.
But they saw he may have been disgruntled with the American government and had a couple conversations. The details aren't specific, but I'm sure there was a couple pitches of like, hey, well, why don't you come over here? We can help you out a little bit, or you can start giving us some information. We'll help you out. But you have a man who probably doesn't really need any help.
Not only that, the weirdest thing I think, and that's weirdest is carrying a lot of water in this podcast, but he was so not political in the things that he did and said. Like, he kind of gave it to everybody at their time.
The only reason that he wrote that letter is because it was something that directly was related to him.
That he saw with his own eyes.
Yeah,
he was just reporting what he saw in a
Yes.
very scathing manner.
And he had a direct connection and sympathy for those because he had served himself or was wounded and saw what happened in World War One.
Yeah, and not to say that communism is right or fascism would have been right at that time, but he had already been over to Spain and seen what he had loved about Spain for so long that he didn't want to see fascists come in and ruin Spain because that was what he loved. So it wasn't necessarily about a political ideology, as it was just about what him seeing as something is right and something is wrong.
Yeah.
So the connections that they had, like Chris said, not anything that I would say was solid. Like when they looked through the article, or not the article, but the file that they had on him, he hadn't really given them anything of importance.
No, it was basically like a dossier on him about how they could possibly try to reach him or try to get him over. It wasn't like he had a file of missions that he had done for the pre-KGB or anything.
Yeah. So, I mean, there was a connection, not really that connection. But after he gets back, early 1939, Hemingway moves to Cuba.
Havana.
And this is during the separation with Pauline, as we sort of alluded to when we introduced Martha into this story. He was joined by Martha down there, so I'm sure things started off pretty hot and heavy down in Cuba. But after the divorce was finalized, he married Martha November 20th in 1940. This time, in that same weird place, that same odd travel triangle of Cuba, France, or Cuba, Europe, and Wyoming. They were married in Wyoming.
Well, and you got to think, like, at a time, probably like a question would be like, well, why is he living in Cuba? Like, this is at a time where, if you're thinking about it, this is pre-Castro.
Yep.
Bay of Pigs, all that kind of stuff. What was it called when they were Cuban Missile Crisis?
Yeah.
So Havana is basically just like fucking popping. It's gambling. It's fucking nightlife. It's all that crazy shit when you think of like fucking Cuban flavor and all that shit.
Yeah, I could go on for days about all the cool things. I think that can't do it.
Well,
Can't say it out loud. All the cool Cuban things that, like, it's. I don't know if you can say that
are Cuban.
Yeah,
but in this situation, Martha, having maybe kind of looked into the past a little bit and said, I can't let this motherfucker get out around other women, or I'm going to end up the next divorce, and he's going to be marrying the woman he's cheating on me with. So instead of allowing them to live in like downtown Havana, where Ernest, had a little more access to the nightlife and everything, she actually moved them into, what was the name of the estate? The Pica? I can't remember what it is. But she ends up moving them into like an estate outside of Havana. And I'll look up the name for it here in a second. But that was kind of what was thought to be part of her intention, was moving him away to kind of remove some of the temptation.
Yeah. I do wonder, like, do you think that all the time that he had spent in Cuba when he was living in Key West, and just the amount of like relationships that he established in Cuba at that time, when he's like, hey boys, moving in, everybody's like, fuck, we only had to see this guy like 3 days a week before. Now he's just going to be on this close ass island that we're going to be seeing his ass every single day. And I don't know what it was about him.
Depends on if he was good about buying rounds.
Yeah, he had this propensity to like want to physically try people, which I think plays into a theory that I'm going to spring on you a little bit later. But
the finca.
The finca?
Finca Veriga or Vigia, and what? Oh fuck! I remembered what the translation was. It was like Watchful Hill, because you could see over the whole, like the whole area.
Hopefully, it's Havana. Not verga, because verga is penis.
No, I don't think it's Finca Veriga.
Okay,
is that what it is in Cuban as well?
It's Spanish. I don't know what it is in Cuban, but there were situations like he would meet these people, and because he was a boxer back then, he always thought that he could like outbox people. Mm-hmm. So he would be in a situation where they'd be hanging out, and he'd be like, "Hey, F. Scott, you want to throw hands? Like, you want to have a little fun? You want to box?" And there were times when he would, slap the guy around. There were a few times in his life where he'd say, "Hey, do you want to box?" And the guy would be like, "Yeah, sure. I know a little bit about boxing." And they'd put on the gloves, and guy would just light Hemingway up. Just straight jabs to the face. And he was such just a bad loser at everything that I don't remember who it was that he was boxing against, but the guy had stuck him in the mouth 2 or 3 times, and his mouth was just filling up with blood as they were sparring, and he hit him one more time, and Hemingway just turned around and spit his blood on the dude. Like, it was that kind of a poor sport about losing and shit. So
This is how I win.
Yeah, so all these Cubans are down there like, God, that guy that gets drunk and wants to box us all the time is moving in now.
Fucking blood spitter. Shit. God damn it. So yeah, and it means the hill farm.
Oh,
that's what the translation of it is. But this is, and this place is still available to be seen in Havana. It's actually like a national monument down there. And weirdly enough, apparently, like between that and his actual the boat, the Pilar, there have been like joint United States Cuban, like projects.
It's the only thing
That's the only thing they'll fucking agree on is Hemingway. Fuck everything else, but when it comes to Hemingway, everyone's like, we claim him, we claim him. When did he start going to Sun Valley?
He was just...
Because I heard that he went between, like, also, and it also makes sense because Havana is the place where he lives the longest, but he would go between, like, one of the stops that he would make would be in Sun Valley, Idaho.
Yeah, he kind of adopted the snowbird thought process way earlier in life than most people do, but he would spend his summers at a residence in just a little town outside of another little town, Sun Valley, Idaho, in Ketchum. And I still believe that his house in Ketchum has been preserved as well. So I think there's some monuments in that area, kind of, and I have been to Sun Valley and Ketchum myself. I think you might have too.
I haven't yet.
But there's a lot of like subtle nods in these small towns in Idaho where it's like, yeah, this is Hemingway's Benny's and like breakfasts and drinks and all sorts of things named after him.
This is kind of one of, I think I've talked to you about this, but this was also one of the things that was kind of like about Hemingway is how it can get kind of culty. There can be like some Hemingway cultishness. Like when you, like, there's like these weird like monuments to North, and I realize there's probably like if there was Mark Twain's house, which I think that's a real thing. It's like Mark Twain's house is a monument or something like that.
Graceland, man.
There you go. Okay, but still at the same time, like to have 3 of these fucking places and have everyone being like, no, he belongs to us. No, he belongs to us.
I think part of it though,
everyone wants to claim it a little bit, have that little claim.
Yeah, but think of the way that you and I started this research and our thoughts on Hemingway.
Yeah.
Think about where we sit now.
Yeah.
Like once you hear some of this shit, you just can't help but be like, and have
so
a smile on your
there
face.
is a seductive quality to Hemingway. I can't think is what you're saying. And if you don't already start out in a negative viewpoint and it's nothing but positive, it can take you into that culty,
much faster,
worshipy type shit.
We came into it negative and ended up sort of even.
Yeah.
If you started even, you're hitting positive real quick.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So, yeah, he would spend his summers in Ketchum. He would spend his winters in Cuba. When it was hot in Cuba, his ass would be in western Idaho, maybe. And then when it was cold as shit there in the wintertime, he'd be down in the warm-ass Cuba. Like, that's a brilliant way to live your life. And that was 1939. And he ended up, or I guess it was 38 into 39, because in 1939, he published For Whom the Bell Tolls. So...
And that was the one about the Spanish Civil War, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
So again, just taking from that information that he had just absorbed being in the Spanish Civil War, all of a sudden you're on the other side of it writing a fictional sort of true story.
Yes. And with that book, it's basically like, boom, Hemingway's back.
Yeah, they loved him. And
like we're the like you thought he was done, you thought he was out, he's back.
Yeah, he kind of reclaimed that spot that we were talking about of being like the greats. He had a few stinkers in there. He had a few throwaways, and this was just, he was right in there again.
He's like Brendan Fraser.
Yeah, hopefully with less male-on-male exploitation.
Yeah, that's true. Okay.
The NKVD was the predecessor to the
that's
KGB.
Right, yep.
And the NKVD may have had some more contacts. His current wife, Bellhorn,
Gellhorn.
Gellhorn. That's right. Bellhorn didn't sound right.
What was her first name? Martha.
Martha was on assignment as a writer herself in China in 1941. Hemingway, I'm sure, was over there with her trying to figure out how to stir some shit up in China so he could
looking for some strange in the East.
Yeah. Do you think that he might have started the conflict and tensions between Japan and China?
I wouldn't put it past him.
He was.
This is 41, so I think shit had been brewing between those two peoples for a while then.
But yeah, he may have had more communist ties with the NKVD in China in 1941. At least made contact, at least did a little talking.
Do you know what I think part of it is, too? I don't think he ever had the intention of... He didn't like government in general, I really don't think, which is why he felt so free about moving to all these different places. There was never a concern with him living in all these different places, different parts of the world. Like, he just goes to China to do this. I think part of it, what it was also, is... It was just like for the story. Like, why can't I talk to these guys? Like, this would be like cool. I could write this shit down. Like, I should play these guys a little bit. Like, find out where it fucking goes. Like, it's part of the adventure.
Well, and had the predecessor been like, we're going to make you our top spy, he'd probably been like, I'm going to hang out with you.
Yeah, exactly.
If you're going to make me number one, I'm in. Like, let's do this. But since it was just like, hey, we need this, this, and this from you, he's probably like, I'm just going to be apolitical. And that's what I was talking about with, like, when he spoke out against America. He didn't really give a shit about politics. He didn't really give a shit about communist, capitalist, anything like that. He just saw good and bad, sort of.
Yeah.
And he was mostly bad, but he was fighting for some
other women when he was married. Yeah.
fighting for some noble causes along the way.
And so, again, this is 1941. So, depending on when in 1941, if it's not toward the end of it, the Japanese haven't bombed Pearl Harbor, I would assume at this point.
Because they had moved back to Cuba, or they had returned to Cuba before the U.S. declared into World War II.
Okay. And basically, what he ends up doing for his service for World War II is fucking bonkers, but might be one of the most brilliant things I've ever heard anybody do. So, he's a celebrity at this point. He lives in Cuba, and he basically goes to the military, and he says... I have a boat. Why don't you guys give me weapons I can put on my boat? He's like, and I'll patrol for U-boats. Because apparently, down in the Caribbean, there was like quite a few. I'm trying to think what they said. 13 ships sunk like weekly shipping, like United States or Allied ships, by U-boats down in the Caribbean. Because weirdly enough as it sounds, man, there were U-boats that sailed all the way across the Atlantic to like the eastern seaboard and also into the Caribbean.
You could see that, though, because you had to get past sort of the blockades of what was going on in England at the time, probably. So you wanted to be further in the Atlantic towards the side that wasn't at war with you yet.
Yeah.
And you wanted to disrupt kind of that trade back and forth.
That's true, because if you're going to England, they know what route you're going to take, whereas you could possibly be taking your stuff to supply in Italy or North Africa or something, then move it up that way. Yeah, that makes sense.
I had heard this
there
twice.
Would be stuff going both ways.
Yeah.
You'd be sending shipping both ways. Yeah.
I'd heard two different versions of this. One was the American military. The other one was the Cuban military. And his pitch was to the Cubans was, I'll go out and defend your guys' part of the Caribbean and make sure that they don't get in here to you.
I'm pretty confident it was the American military, because I don't think the Cuban military had the weaponry at the time in World War II to outfit his boat.
I don't think it was the weaponry he wanted.
It wasn't, but here's what I'm getting at. So he basically gets set up with like this naval liaison officer who pretty much provides him like arms and everything. But what they also provided him was something that had been rationed during the war, and that was diesel. So Hemingway, surprise, no confirmed U-boat sinkings, but he had one.
He had one where they put on a real valiant chase. I guess they had spotted it and the guns or something wasn't right. Probably they were all piss-ass drunk on the boat when they saw it. And they went on a chase, or it was just like a wave that might have been taller than the rest of them that they thought they were chasing.
Just like,
could have been a whale, yeah.
That had just surfaced for a second. But basically what the thought process is that he used this as an excuse to go out and fish, because it was the way for him to get diesel fuel as well.
Yep.
Plus, I mean, if something were to happen, he did happen to sink a U-boat or get in some type of engagement. Can you imagine the fucking story about that?
Yeah. A world famous author Ernest Hemingway sinks U-boat in the Caribbean.
Come on, like fucking seriously?
That's everywhere.
Yes. And so he ends up, unfortunately getting skunked in his U-boat hunt. And he actually went to, this is where the whole, and up to this point with between Paris, where all these authors are, the Forrest Gump comparison right here.
Yeah.
He is out on a ship during fucking D-Day.
A lander. Like one of the ships that took the
That
soldiers.
were the ones that were had troops, but he wasn't on one of the Higgins boats.
I thought he was, but he wasn't on one of the ones that landed.
No, but he was on one of the Higgins because those things were so unstable. He was on one of the troop transports that were lowering guys onto Higgins boats.
Okay.
And was there like as a war correspondent, but basically because some of the shit went south during the Normandy landings, and I want to say he might have been at Omaha.
I think
that was going to be the American beach that they were landing at.
And they started to take cannon fire, and so they turned him around.
Yep, so
he was like...
Yep, because they couldn't land any war correspondents or journalists on the beach.
He was they called him like precious cargo or something like that. Like if he went over there and he died, I'm sure that probably would have been some scuttlebutt about that.
A little bit of a morale boost for the Nazis. We got Hemingway.
This, just to start with that, the fact that this gets just so much more unbelievable as we go on.
It's so funny to think about because it sounds completely made up bullshit. Like, oh yeah, and did you also? It would just be on the list of accolades. It's the Chuck Norris shit.
Did you know I was in World War II?
Yeah, it's just that thing where it's like, oh, and did you know that Hemingway also was on one of the ships during Operation Overlord? Like, no, he was. How many more things is this guy going to fucking do? It's like, well, I didn't say he landed, but he was there on one of the ships in the English Channel watching the fucking beach landings happen.
So this is, if we're talking about stories that happened during World War II, while like on a scale of like 1 to 10. I don't know how the fuck
this didn't come up during the Overlord research.
Yeah, it probably should have. That might have been an oversight. But on like a 1 to 10 Hemingway scale...
I'm actually glad it didn't, because if that's including, hey, by the way, Hemingway was on one of these boats, I think you're missing the point of what that whole thing was about. Yeah.
But this is like a 3 on this trip for a Hemingway deal, because after this, he rides around and he ends up, after he does the Normandy landings, he is present at the liberation of Paris. He had said that when they swept into Paris, he had gone and taken over what was the hotel? It was the hotel that they had always stayed at.
Like the Royal Parisian or something like that.
God, I want to say that it's still there. But he had said that they had liberated the bar as well.
That's right. Him and like a colonel or an admiral or something like that.
When in all actuality, they had already...
Ritz.
Huh?
It was at the Ritz.
The Ritz. Okay,
That's
the Ritz,
right.
yeah. So he said that he went and liberated the bar at the Ritz. But in all actuality, they had already swept and taken back over Paris, and he had just sort of rolled in after everything had happened.
He was with the occupation force, or like the conquering force. It's not like he was the tip of the spear coming in being like, they had swept in, they had claimed Paris. Sure, there could have been a sniper hiding somewhere or something like that. But yeah.
So that...
But still.
We'll give that a 5 on the Hemingway story scale. We'll skip a little bit ahead for a second, just because this is another lower number. Covered the Battle of the Bulge. Like he was there
In
at
Bastogne.
the battle.
In Bastogne.
Yeah, at the Battle of the Bulge. So that's got to be a 4.
Again, he wasn't there on the line, on the front or anything like that, but he was there covering it.
So that, again, we'll call that a 4, maybe like a 6, just because of that famousness. If we want to know what a 10 is on the Hemingway scale, on his way through, he had befriended a group of rebel French fighters and had taken them over as their captain.
Oh, yeah.
He talked these guys into following him as their general while he was a war correspondent, and had led these guys back to the battalion that he was following around with. And they're like, what the fuck is that? He's like, these are my guys.
Yeah, I found these guys and all their guns and shit.
Turns out they know who I am. They're a pretty big fan of me. They made me their general, so I'm going to go ahead and take them in. And he ends up getting...
It's like when you go on a fucking desert island, like they just made me their king.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. he ends up getting brought on charges because apparently it's very illegal for somebody that's a war correspondent to actually take
Or
control.
to form like a militia during fucking active wartime or some shit.
And his remarks back to it, I don't remember what it was exactly, but he's like, I couldn't show up empty-handed.
Yeah.
Like, I had to bring in these rebel fighters with me as I came in. Like, I needed a big grand entrance. So that would be a 10 on a Hemingway story that he went over as a war correspondent, tore off his war correspondent, like, patch.
See, but who's corroborated this story? 'Cause this is what I'm talking about. This sounds...
They brought him up on charges for this, so this was like an official thing.
I heard some stuff that he also got into a couple skirmishes with these rebel fighters. Like, there was actual stuff that he did. Maybe he just brought them back to camp, and that was like his initial action. Then he was going to do some shit. But I think maybe there might have been some embellishment about like what he did along like fighting like the
Definitely
Nazis
could
with
have
these
been.
guys. Yeah,
But just the fact that he shows up in a foreign country that's not foreign to him and then runs into some regulars, he's like, hey.
Rolls into the fucking command post, and not only is it some American guy, a war correspondent, like with a bunch of like French rebels, it's fucking Ernest Hemingway.
Yep.
And that goes so much into the he just thought he could do whatever. Like that probably didn't, like, the idea of him getting in trouble for that probably had never entered his head.
That never crossed his mind. Trouble was the furthest thing that he was thinking about at that point.
Well, we find ourselves in March 1945, and it's been a while. So what do we get to? Time on the old expiration clock for his marriage is starting to run out.
Yeah, we forgot to mention it. Again, use our little bit of words to figure out what's coming up next. But when he landed in Europe in 1944, he met a girl named Mary Welsh. So again, by how this story is gone, I think we know
dirty dog
where
out of your fucking sight for a minute, and especially not in a war. This is what gets his dick the hardest.
Oh yeah,
he had his first war boner back in WW1. Fell in love with a nurse who broke his heart.
And now
around war now, he's just looking to plow.
Yeah, now he's got it figured out. Now he wants to make sure to get her nailed down before he leaves the country. So he goes ahead, brings her back. Martha divorces him in 1945. He marries Mary, rough wordage, in 1946. So maybe he gave it a little bit more time. I don't know when it was in 45 and 46. Like, it could have been December, January, like most of the other relationships have been, but there may have been some time this time. And Mary was like determined to be the last Hemingway wife.
Were all determined to be the last Hemingway wife.
This lady put up with a lot of shit. There was an argument that they had gotten into in a hotel, and he had pulled out his trusty shotgun that keeps showing up in this story too, and he had actually, out of anger, fired the shotgun in the hotel room and blew up the toilet in the bathroom. She stuck around through that, so she was pretty determined to be the last one. 1947, he receives a Bronze Star for bravery for taking over not for taking the rebel French troops, but just for being over there and probably seeing so much shit that he had seen. And 47 gets really rough because he's starting to lose a lot of his friends. They're dying early by all accounts. His body really starts
such as artists do.
Yeah. His body starts to slow down pretty immensely. Like, it's being overweight has really kicked in. Hypertension in his heart starting to work. I'm sure his liver was probably screaming for any sort of help. Things start to get a little bit rough for him.
What was his drinking regimen like? I'm trying to remember.
I never saw specifically his drinking regimen, but one of the quotes that he had about kind of his day was, he says, when I'm working on a book or a story, I write every morning as soon as the first light is possible. There's no one to disturb you, and it is cool or cold. You come to your work, and warm as you write, you read what you have written, and as you always stop when you know what is going to happen next. That seems weird to stop when you know what's going to happen next. And then you go on from there. You write until you come to a place where you still have your juice and know what will happen next, and you stop and try to live through until the next day when you can hit it again. Which is very apt for him, because after he got done writing and starting boozing and going out on the deep sea fishing boat, like, living to write again the next day seems pretty poignant for him.
Yeah.
have started at 6 in the morning and say you may go on until noon or be through before that. When you stop, you are as empty and at the same time never empty but filling as when you have made love to someone you love. Nothing can hurt you. Nothing can happen. Nothing means anything until the next day when you do it again. It is the wait until the next day that is hard to get through. Pretty passionate words for a guy who I think was just sort of passionate about everything.
Yeah.
Like even the bad things he was passionate about. He was passionate about hating his boys. He was bad about loving his wives. He just, whatever he did, good or bad, he threw himself into it.
Yeah, definitely. Well, born of all that experience and the stories and everything like that, well, actually, that's going to be a little bit later. Sorry. In 1947, he actually gets the Bronze Star for bravery.
Yeah.
I don't know what the situation was for that. Was it just him being a war correspondent?
Like I was saying, it would have had to have been Omaha Beach.
I don't know.
Just being out there during a fire like that, or being fired at.
I don't know if it's like an honorary thing, because he was never in the actual military. I don't know how that works with like a war correspondent.
No.
So in 1950, Across the River and Into the Trees is released, and that one is not received very well.
Well, it was also a double, because he had written it over in France, where he was staying with the royal family, him and Mary were, and he took a liking to the guys, to the king or to the nobleman, whoever it was, his 19-year-old daughter.
Really?
Yep. And this is the one exception to the rule of this entire story. He doesn't marry her, but he becomes infatuated with her. And the whole premise behind Across the River and Into the Trees is basically like the love story of an old tattered general that falls for this young vixen. And so he has his muse, but he doesn't marry her this time.
Do you think Mary's looking at him read this book, being like, who the fuck's this vixen?
Oh, yeah. I think she knew pretty well.
You better not be that old motherfucking general.
Yeah. I think it was over
No,
in
honey,
Venice.
he's French. He's French. That's, completely
That's
different
not me.
people. Yeah, that's totally not me.
I'm from Chicago, babe. I'm not from France.
Yeah.
So that's where I say, like, Mary was bound and determined. Like, he wrote this book about this 19-year-old girl, and she was just bound and determined to be the last Hemingway wife. So she was cool with it, gets through it. The book is just absolutely torn apart. It's made fun of. They say that he's lost his fastball. Same old boring Hemingway now is coming out. Like, all these bad things are being said about him.
Give us something new.
Yeah, and he responds in kind. It takes him a little bit longer, but this is where he finally writes The Old Man and the Sea. And The Old Man and the Sea, the main character in it, technically the only character in it, the only human character in it, is, is written about his captain of the Pilar.
Yeah.
And just about the experiences that he draws from his bravery and the way that he does things is how The Old Man and the Sea is written. And The Old Man and the Sea, again, my level of books isn't really great, but Old Man and the Sea was fantastic. I loved it. And everybody else did too, because it secured him the Pulitzer Prize in May 1953.
Nice.
Which, that's got to be big. The fact that he had done so much work before and it took him all this time until 1953. I'm sure getting a Pulitzer is very, very hard. But the fact that he finally gets it after his last book was just unanimously hated, it was like the biggest fuck you to come back and get a win like that.
I'm sure. I would imagine.
1954, we see the man go all the way back to Africa again. And this trip is a little bit different than the first time. Goes over there with Mary. They are involved in a plane crash that he lives through. That him, his wife, Mary, and the pilot all lived through. Their injuries were bad enough that they couldn't be treated in the town that they were brought to after the crash.
You don't say that there's not a lot of places in Africa at the time in 54 that you can be treated after a plane crash.
Yeah, probably not. So what do? And I mean, luck is on your side. If you just got in a plane crash that day and you were being flown out to go to somewhere else, like you can't get in 2 plane crashes within 24 hours, right? Just impossible.
One would think.
Well, we're talking about Ernest Hemingway here. We're talking about the literary Forrest Gump. Gets in another plane crash the very next day.
It's literally the rescue plane.
Yeah.
To get them out and to get them treatment.
It's incredible. This is like Howard Hughes level shit.
Well, and this one actually fucks him up pretty bad.
Yeah.
So he ends up getting like burns over like a good portion of his body. He gets a concussion because for some reason he hits the door with his head to try to open the door. I don't know if his legs are broken or something like that. He had some internal injuries, right?
Yeah.
And he broke it. I think he broke his arm as well. And there was a couple other things. But he's already been someone that has had at minimum one, maybe two concussion, minimum two, because you had it up here that didn't
he had at least 6 or 7 pretty traumatic brain injuries.
One of them he got like hit in the head on the boat or some shit like that.
There was another one that we forgot to mention during World War II, but he went over to World War II as a correspondent.
Yeah.
As he got over there, he went ahead and Gellhorn was supposed to come with him.
Yeah.
And as she was on her way over there, all he had to do was secure her a press visa to come over. He didn't get around to it. I mean, he'd met Mary at this point, I think, so it probably was tough to remember. She ends up having to come over to World War II on an ammunition boat across the sea as like a hard target. I'm sure ammunition boats coming over to refuel the war efforts, those were probably
I don't know if you
spotted.
can know that that's what was on it, but any type of shipping was targeted. Yeah.
So she's very pissed at him and finally ends up making it over like weeks after he'd gotten there. Before he got there, before she got there, he got in a car crash, broke his arm, head injury again there. He's in the hospital when Martha gets there, and she walks in. She's like, "What the fuck, dude? Where was my
Mary's
press
hiding
pass?"
behind the door. Fuck.
She's like, "Where's my press pass?" He's like, "Hey, you made it."
Just points at his arm.
Yeah.
I got hurt. That was 2 days ago.
Yeah, she is just fucking pissed at him and just storms off. Like, no care that he was in this car crash. But there again, just another scenario where it comes back around for him. Karma comes back around for him.
And there's something about him when his body starts to slow down and everything. He starts to also, after, that book isn't well received, he has this thing about, I don't know if it's about growing old or weakness or being incapable, but the second plane crash, essentially, he never fully recovers from some of those.
No.
From some of those injuries. He still carries, some pain and probably a lot of fucking trauma from crashing twice in fucking the course of like 1 or 2 days.
Well, so long, too, that when October 1954 rolls around and he receives the Nobel Prize for Literature, he just has to write in a thank you, like a speech, because he's still at home recovering.
Yeah, where is it held at?
I
I want to say it's somewhere in Europe, right?
Luxembourg, maybe?
Yeah, somewhere. And this guy will do anything to get to fucking Europe.
Yeah.
Any chance he
think,
meets all his new wives in Europe or some shit. So he's like, I can't get over and get my new wife. I mean, my Nobel Prize.
Maybe that was it. Maybe Mary was running Munchausen syndrome on him and just keeping him sick so he couldn't get over there and try to find a new wife.
We got a Kathy Bates misery
Yeah.
situation going on. He's a writer. That's where the inspiration for where Stephen King got it. It was actually Mary keeping him fucking home.
Last time they went over there, Mary dodged the bullet of the 19-year-old Italian princess
yeah.
and wasn't going to take another chance on it. But he seems like pretty fulfilled, and I'm sure at this point, like this is, you basically receive sainthood while you're still alive. That's pretty huge to get the Nobel Prize for Literature. And after that, he starts to move towards building his memoir, which was A Movable Feast. There was a situation, I think it goes all the way back, I think Hadley was the one, where she was coming to him while he was on location writing, and he had asked her to bring all of his previous works, and this is back in the Hadley days, so nothing had been published.
Oh,
yet.
yes, I heard about this.
And as she was coming through a train station, the trunk that had all of his old works was stolen, so he basically lost everything that he had.
It was like the copies and like the carbon originals.
Yeah.
All of it. And it was like 3 books worth of his early works.
Everything was gone. Well, he ends up back in Paris finding like 2 or 3 things that hadn't made it into the trunk that he hadn't known that weren't stolen. So he starts to add those into the memoir to start building it. But he's working on that. He's working on some short stories. Like, he wasn't single-minded in what he was doing, so it just kept getting pushed off. And they end up buying their house outside of Ketchum in Idaho, 1959, and they need to do it because July 25th, 1960, they leave Cuba for good.
So,
And
yeah, this is when Castro starts coming into power. This is when there's...
the Cuban Revolution happens.
Yep, the Cuban Revolution happens. This is when there starts to become, again, this is going to be in the Cold War. Like, Cold War is popping off at this point. We're now in the 60s. So, Cuban Revolution, it's hostile for Americans. If Hemingway had it his way, he would have fucking stayed.
Yeah.
I mean, if it wasn't, there, certain things were unavoidable, but Hemingway, in his eyes, he I don't know if he was a man that didn't really identify with the country, I think, in some ways. I think he did and didn't. He just kind of wanted to be like a citizen of all these different cultures. And when he was down there in Cuba, because he lived there so long, he considered himself just to be another Cuban, Cuban national.
Yeah.
And so for him to have to leave, because when he left, they said he left basically like he was coming back. He didn't pack up anything. Like, all the stuff they have preserved down there, it looks like someone just stepped out to run to the fucking grocery store. And so when he had to leave, I think not only just the physical losing that place that he'd been so long, I think psychologically to not be allowed to go back to probably his favorite place, the place that he stayed the longest, the place where he could go out and sport fish and do all that kind of stuff. Like, when it wasn't his decision, yeah, man, at that point, and we're going to get into it here in a second, that I think was just kind of the last straw. It was, he had all this freedom to go where he wanted, and now the one place that he perhaps wants to go the most, he's not allowed to go. And he's experiencing basically the deterioration of his body, and now he's missing what he's had his entire life is that freedom.
Well, and you have to think, too, as his body starts to fail him, travel becomes much tougher.
Yeah.
And so he doesn't get to live that part of his life and that with that vibrance that he had of being able to, be like a temporary citizen in an area.
He's no longer Ernest going out, cheating on his wife, marrying the next one. He's not that Ernest anymore.
Apparently.
I mean, he could be if he had the physical attributes, but...
This, I'm sure, isn't a shot at the women of Ketchum that he didn't find himself one last and final wife there. His body may have just finally gone.
Yeah.
But
there's probably some sturdy gals in Ketchum.
Could be.
Logging women.
Some winter hardened women down there. December 1960, he is admitted to the Mayo Clinic for, I think they said hypertension was the first time, but mentally, he was really struggling. Like, his depression had kind of fully kicked in. There's sort of an interesting theory, I guess, that it was for the prior 2 or 3 generations before Hemingway, there had been somebody in the family line that had committed suicide. Mm-hmm. And so they almost believe like that it was sort of like a
genetic predisposition.
Yes, to have the kind of depression I think that he had suffered from. And, I mean, I really, even without that kind of predisposition, I think that he had probably seen some pretty bad shit and probably had been a party to some atrocities that had weighed on his mind. He had seen a lot. And
maybe he was able to compartmentalize that a lot when he was younger. And now that he was kind of left with a situation in which he didn't have all of his physical faculties and all this stuff to distract him or to fill that void. And he just sat, especially writing his memoirs, he was having to probably revisit a lot of that shit, I would imagine. And some of that just knowing that, first of all, he's old. He's not going to be that young man again. And then having to write down all these things that he's lost and things like that. And knowing that maybe knowing essentially his best days are behind him. Yeah, when he went to the Mayo Clinic in 1960, the fucking treatment at that point was electroconvulsive therapy, and that's where they hook up what you see in fucking like American Horror Story and shit like that, where they hook up the fucking electrodes, and you think they're gonna fucking what do they call lobotomize?
Yeah,
like electronically lobotomize someone and basically pass a current through your fucking brain. And after the first time, like the first session that did this, it didn't help him. It, in fact, made it harder for him to remember shit and made it harder for him to essentially try to be normal.
Well, yeah, they hit him with it 15 times.
Yeah. I don't know how the fuck this was ever thought of and not only that, but he's like a fucking famous person. Like that's like the kind of treatment that you would go to if you didn't have means, it seems like.
I think they still do it today, honestly. I think that it's still a part of a regimen today. So back then, I'm sure it was probably like, this is top of the line technology that we're going to hit you with. Now, this is probably like the last thing that they try.
There was another incident too where, and it's going to kind of lead up to the incident, but there was another one where I want to say it was his wife came in and he was sitting with a shotgun on his lap, and the two shells were on the windowsill, but within reach. Mm-hmm. And she just sat down and started talking to him and everything. And then I don't know if she had called someone or had like signaled to someone to call and called his doctor again. And the doctor came in and they talked and were able to get the gun away from him. And I think he had to go back for another fucking round at the Mayo Clinic where they're like, oh, this thing that apparently had so much success, maybe we didn't shock him enough.
Or maybe we hit him too many times. Maybe we just go 10 this time.
We got to try to reverse course.
Yeah.
We use a reverse current or some shit like that and try to get him back to where he was.
You think that's what it was? Was they just swapped the electrodes on either side of his head this time?
You know what? We may have had these on wrong the first time. I think these might have been reversed. People are not good at labeling these.
Yeah, turns out that it didn't really matter, though.
No.
Because upon returning home, I think it was like 2 days after he had been home.
Yep. So on July 2nd, 1961, he shoots himself with said shotgun. And
with his favorite shotgun, he said.
Yeah, with his favorite shotgun. And in Ketchum Sun Valley area. So that's Idaho's claim to fame when it comes to Hemingway, is we were the place that killed Hemingway.
Oh, that's rough. He had seen some bad stuff. I can't be a reflection on the good people of Ketchum. I don't know if they're good or not, but yeah, that's rough, man. It's a tough way to go out, but it plays so much into his father shooting himself if he had these other suicides in further generations. And he had said something along the lines when he started losing friends that every man dies the same way. The only thing that's different is how they're remembered and what's said about them after they die.
It's something like that, or it's something about the manner in which the
lives they lived and the stories they told.
Something like that. But I think, to Hemingway, and no one can assume the reason unless there's a very clearly written note and it actually tells the truth about why someone does something. But I think for Hemingway, it really was just a matter of him maybe understanding that the best days were past him, and that just after the life that he had lived, maybe he just felt that he didn't want to just deteriorate and drift off into nothingness. That this was maybe the last bit of control that he had was doing this action.
The decline came pretty quickly. So.
Definitely. And then A Movable Feast, which was his memoir, was published in 1964.
So posthumously, 3 years afterwards, I wonder if they had somebody who had known him maybe come through and try to organize the thoughts, or they just released it as it was.
Yeah, I mean, and in a lot of those situations, they'll have family come in or friends come in that might have been writers and try to kind of clean it up, or editors, and then the family reads and approves it. But it ended up making it out. I don't, I've never read it myself or anything like that. It might be time I actually pick it up and take a look at this, how this guy described his life. That's the tricky thing I think about memoirs, is memoirs are going to be from the person that it's discussing. And so with this guy, I'm sure most of it will be true, but there's always going to be that question about, which of these situations did he put his Hemingway twist on it?
Yeah, either that or like how many things did he see that it wasn't him, but goes into the book as an action that he took. So I think at this point, I feel like just after going through everything that he did, he kind of deserves it. Like this is sort of in the same vein of like, because I've told you, whenever somebody asks me my age now, I just fire the first number off my head. Like, I just lie about it because it's so low stakes that it just doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. If somebody's like, how old are you? And I say 26, it's not going to matter that I'm 30, whatever. Like, it's never going to play a role. Like, after you turn whatever age to rent a car, your age really doesn't matter at that point. So, with him, I feel like he's lived such a life to where I really have no problem with him making these things up. Like he's done enough in his life to deserve.
That's the crazy thing is you don't know.
Yeah.
There's not a clear line about what could be embellished or what couldn't be embellished.
But it doesn't make me mad at what he would have embellished.
Yeah, at this point too, you can almost like he's such a fantastical person that you can almost identify this guy as a character in himself. You could almost read his memoirs and be like, this is the fictional version. I kind of envision it like it might be, or that Hemingway kind of comes across as, in This Is the End, that one with Seth Rogen and James Franco.
Yeah, oh yeah.
They're just playing exaggerated versions of themselves or their worst qualities. I think maybe to some degree, like he might just be in life, he seems like an exaggerated person.
Yeah.
So for that to have that type of restraint or not try to do that in your works would be tricky. I'd always be wondering, is this true? Is this true? But maybe that's the point, is not knowing. His life was so crazy that you wouldn't be able to tell.
He just literally, he led a fairly, in the off season when he wasn't away at war, he led a fairly relaxed life. But you have to imagine any time you were around Hemingway, like you had to be on edge that you were either going to hear some shit that you didn't expect and that you don't know is true, or you were going to go out and fight like a 5-foot marlin in the afternoon after drinking like a fifth of scotch. Like,
Yeah.
Anytime you were around him, it was lazy and relaxing to him, but to everybody else, like you had to be ready for some shit to happen.
That's what I'm saying, is to everyone else, a day with Hemingway could be the story of their life.
Yep.
It would be the thing that they remembered most or talked about most. And for Hemingway, it was just another day.
Just a Tuesday.
Yep. All right. You got anything else?
One little thing. I have a couple odd sort of theories about Hemingway. Along with his NKVD ties, he also had some ties into the CIA and the FBI.
Was it the OSS before?
The
or was
OSS,
it
yes.
The OSS, okay, the precursor to the CIA. The World War II, basically what it came out of World War II, the OSS became the CIA.
I'm sure it was probably started, well, it could have even been started around the bad note that he had written, the bad letter that he had written about the U.S. But I'm sure him being over in the Spanish Civil War was probably covered in there. I'm sure him going over into World War II, they probably were keeping an eye on him. And everything that he really kind of stood for with just his apathy towards government. He had a file on him, and J. Edgar Hoover had gone through it, and J. Edgar Hoover personally had gone through it because there's actually citations in his handwriting in this file, and basically had deemed him to be too much of a star and too much of a famous person, that it would be too hard to keep him as like a KGB spy or like a Soviet spy.
Basically was able to go ahead and discount him as a spy because it would be too difficult for someone of that status to maintain it.
Yeah, which, good for him. Also, we have a gentleman named Martin Luther King who was not meeting on a regular basis in foreign countries with communists and not doing anything else. When J. Edgar Hoover saw his file, he's like, gotta kill that guy. That guy's a threat. Hemingway, white guy, hanging out with the communists, probably not a communist. Luther King, talking about people's rights, definitely a commie. Like that feels like there's some
You
weird...
know who has rights? Communists.
Yeah, dude, that just seems like a weird privilege.
Like, actually, Mr. Hoover, that doesn't sound right. I don't think communists have very many rights.
Yeah, it blows me away. And the second thing, we won't get into this too much, but I don't know where his sort of machismo comes from, but I feel like there's something more hiding under the surface of Hemingway. And I did read some things about possibly Hemingway feeling as if he could have been a trans person back in that time period. I don't think it has really anything to do with his upbringing as much as I do. It always felt like in his stories and in his memoir and things like that, he just really focuses on trying to make the most masculine things happen.
Yeah, like he's overcompensating, overcorrecting, trying to throw somebody off the scent of something that could be the opposite.
Exactly. Yeah, like you said, just overcompensation for something. I don't know what it was. I'm not in any sort of position to be able to diagnose anybody in that way. But everything felt so over the top and extra to the point to where it sort of seemed like there may have been something behind.
The way that he was able to just, not saying able in a good way, but the way that he was able to just switch relationships seemingly with very little effort and just fall in love, or say he fell in love very easily. Paris in the 20s, or at some point, during all these connections, you get out at sea, you're out there fishing for a while. It stands to reason that like one of these love affairs that was never talked about could have possibly been with someone that wasn't a woman.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
as for someone who wanted to experience as much life as possible and made it a point to try to do so, it wouldn't be that surprising. But because, again, he was supposed to be the quintessential, pillar of masculinity and manliness and everything, that was something that maybe afterward he's like, well, now I got to completely steer into the other direction and try to go kill 30 animals on my first fucking safari.
Yeah, maybe it was repressed sexual anger that he was letting out on those poor African
Those poor
beasts.
goddamn animals.
But again, him not being here to say, us not really hearing him bring up this topic, it's all conjecture. He could have been just the straightest man alive.
He's a complicated enough person that adding one more complication isn't outside the realm of possibility.
Yeah.
There's nothing to, possibly maybe substantiate it, but with a lot of people who ended up coming out, or, there's not evidence beforehand until they make it known. And that's even in today's age where everything is documented and everyone's, in front of a fucking lens.
Yeah, to have a different feeling inside of you that is probably pretty unheard of back in that time, and being a man of such stature as he was, we don't really know. And I'm not saying that he was, I'm not saying that he wasn't, I'm just saying that it was interesting throughout his life that it sort of felt like everything was to the nth degree out of almost like a cover.
Yeah.
A little bit. But other than that, I mean, this was super duper enjoyable. I have no problem looking into another author, writer. I'd like to get down to the answer to Fuck Scott Fitzgerald. I really think that we probably need to take a look at him. Joyce, another very interesting cat. But yeah, it just, this opened the door to writers. I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as we did. So yeah, I think I'm good.
Good with me. All right, guys. Thanks again for joining us on another episode, and we'll catch you next time.
Peace.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us for another episode. If you like what you heard, hit that subscribe and like button. Follow us. If you didn't like what you heard, still hit that anyway, because we'll probably cover something in the future that you do like. Please follow us on our social media. Adam, hit them with it.
Our Instagram is historically high pod, historically high pod, and we are on Twitter at historically high. That's historically HI.
All right. And if you guys want to send in any feedback, suggestions, hit us up on those two, or you can even do it on Gmail. It's historicallyhighpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks again.
Peace.